Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Friday, May the 1st, and we're reading Mark chapter 8. Now, it may seem at first glance as though Mark in chapter 8 is just repeating himself with the same stories, but with slight variations. Consider it instead like a song that repeats a refrain, a melody, or a chorus to help us remember it and to sing along. Like with the feeding of the 5,000, which we just saw in chapter 6, and now in chapter 8, the feeding of the 4,000. Notice that in both stories, Jesus not only feeds the crowds, he involves his disciples in the feeding. As N.T. Wright points out, the closer we are to Jesus, the more likely it is that he will call us to share in his work of compassion, healing, and feeding, bringing his kingdom work to an ever wider circle. The Christian life as a disciplined rhythm of following Jesus involves not only being fed, but becoming in turn one through whom Jesus' love can be extended to the world. Now, of course, like with the disciples at the time of the feeding, our resources will seem and feel totally inadequate. This is Jesus' problem, not ours, and these stories indicate well enough how he'll cope with it. Our task, it has been said often enough, but still needs to be heard and acted upon, is not to bemoan how few loaves and fishes we have for the crowd, but to offer them to Jesus, to do whatever he wants with them, and then be ready to distribute them to our own surprise at his command. Now, when we allow God to make use of our time, talents, and resources in response to the needs of our world, the sky's the limit. 12 years ago, when we started working with the Food Grains Bank, we had no idea that a dozen years later we will have worked together to provide over 1.5 million meals. It all begins with Jesus. When he saw the hungry people, he said, "I have compassion for these people. Let's do something for them." And that's the model for our response as well. Sadly, our response most often models not that of Jesus, but the disciples. It's impossible, they say. We don't have enough resources. The problem is too big for us. But it isn't too big for Jesus and us together. Now, the story of the feeding ends with the Pharisees showing up and asking for Jesus to show them a sign from heaven. Since Jesus' run-in with them in the previous chapter, the miracles he performed were done in Gentile areas where the Pharisees would not go, among Gentile people with whom the Pharisees would not associate. Because of their prejudices, they missed everything that had been going on. Their eyes were closed to what God was actually doing among them. Jesus, we are told, sighed deeply. I'll just bet he did. So it's back into the boat and away from the Pharisees. From some people, you just have to walk away, or in Jesus' case, row. Now, a bit of time has passed, and the disciples discover that there's only one loaf in the boat to be divided among all of them. Imagine more of a bun than a loaf, hardly enough for a boat full of fishermen and a Messiah, especially when Peter is there. As they're in the midst of worrying about this, Jesus is still reflecting on his encounter with the Pharisees. Be careful, he warns them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Of course, this stumps the disciples, and a discussion ensues. Their conclusion? He's talking about us not having enough bread. At this point, Jesus comes pretty close to what we would describe as losing it. Here's what he says. "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" In other words, how could this possibly be about not having enough bread? The yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, two groups not often lumped together, is about the insidious form of belief that both groups had, which permeate the world then and our world today. With the Pharisees, it was all about religious control over every waking moment of everyone else's life. With Herod, it was about total constricting political control. Yet neither of these forms of control bring true freedom. neither are the answer. Complete and total trust in God, however, is. Now that's made abundantly clear at the big event in chapter 8, the recognition finally of who Jesus really is, and not by demons, but by the disciples, by, of course, Peter himself. "Who do people say I am?" says Jesus. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets." Now that's interesting. A few chapters ago, in chapter 6, there's a scene in Herod's palace. Herod, who Jesus just mentioned by name a few verses ago. And in that scene in Herod's palace, we witnessed this. King Herod heard about all these miraculous healings, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that's why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said, he's Elijah. And still others claimed, he's a prophet like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. The disciples echo these very same answers. You see how these things tie together. But that sort of answer is not what Jesus is looking for. He isn't looking for opinions. What does everybody think? That's not what Jesus is looking for. Jesus is looking at the heart. What about you? He asked. Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you're the Messiah. Now, right away, Jesus tells the disciples just what that means. That as the Messiah, he will die for the people. Peter, we read, took him aside and began to rebuke him. Strong language, same language that we heard when Jesus rebuked the winds and the waves. And Jesus replies just as strongly. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but the concerns of men. And then, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Now at this point, Jesus' ministry is clear. It is to Jerusalem and to the cross which awaits him that he shall go. And those who wish to be his disciples must follow and risk all. How much will we risk in order to follow Jesus? Tomorrow, chapter 9. Pay special attention to the healing in the middle of it all. Mark spends a long time on it, and so should we. We'll see you then.